So welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sujan Jazz. I'm the Executive Director of California Competes. And today we're going to have a brown bag session led by Will Doyle, focused on the rising cost of college. College affordability has been a major issue for higher education for probably forever. And in California, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we improve affordability for our students. We've had big reforms around our state financial aid program. There are always conversations around tuition setting and what's the right tuition in California. And as these conversations were happening, I began to think about increasingly about the cost of college and sort of what are we chasing as we talk about tuition and increasing financial aid, and began to dig in a little bit on like, why is college so expensive? And the answer was a little more complex than a quick Google search could give me the answer to. So I thought to reach out to some really, really intelligent people, the experts on this, Will Doyle and Jenny Delaney. Sadly, Jenny is not able to join us today. She has been a victim. I shouldn't say victim because she's alive, but COVID hit her and her family. Will is going to take over. So we are going to dig into why is college so expensive? What do we know? What's theorized and what can be done about it? So before we start, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So this is a brown bag session. So I'll turn over to our guest speaker shortly, and will share his presentation, and we'll do a Q&A afterwards, but feel free to jump in with questions throughout. We want this to be, informal. So if it's questions for clarification or just other non-clarification questions, don't hesitate to unmute yourself and jump in, or if you prefer to write it in chat, I'll be monitoring chat and we'll raise those questions also. But when not speaking, of course, we've gotten used to Zoom. Please mute yourself so we can get rid of any background noise. And, feel free to also raise your hand either physically so we can see and we call on you, or using the chat function. I will help monitor that too when Will's speaking. We also will be recording this, and we will send everyone out a copy of the recording and the slides for everyone who registered. So look out for that in case you need to pop off early, or if there's something you wanted to revisit later, or to share with anyone that you think might be interested but wasn't able to make it. All right. And so I would love to also begin a little bit more about who is in our virtual room. So if you want to just put in the chat your name, where you're coming to us from, your organization, or I know there were a number of ledge staff who had registered, what member you work for, and your role that into the chat box, that would be great. And we can get familiar with sort of who's in the room. Like there are a number of names that are new to me too, so that would be great.
You want to go ahead and do that by way of introduction, you mean, right now?
Or via chat. We'll just do it via chat.
Yeah.
Yes. And those of you who are not familiar with California Competes, I would be remiss not to say a little bit about who we are and what we do. So at California Competes, we aim to solve our state's thorny social and economic problems by conducting rigorous higher education and workforce policy research. We view higher education as both an antidote and a vaccine against economic stagnation and social stratification for individual Californians, our communities, and the state's economy. And shortly, we really believe that long-term economic growth for our state will be accomplished through shared prosperity. The things that we're focusing on around that, we have 5 main policy priorities. They're higher education alignment with workforce needs, post-secondary access and success for adults, effective and accessible online education, coordinated policy setting across our public segments, comprehensive education and workforce data, specifically now the launch of the Cradle to Career data system. And as you will see that college affordability is a through line across all of these issues and critical to all of them. And so that's really why we thought it'd be really critical to have this conversation today. And more than just me hopping on a call or meeting with Will, I know that there'd be wide interest in in learning about this with me. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Will Doyle. Will is a professor of higher education in the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organizations at Peabody College of Vanderbilt University. He serves as editor-in-chief of research in higher education, and his own research includes evaluating the impact of higher education policy, the antecedents and outcomes of higher education policy at the state level, and the study of political behavior as it affects higher education. His recent policy-related work has explored volatility in state funding for higher education, the role of higher education in increasing civic behaviors such as voting and volunteering, and the role of geographic opportunity in higher education access and attainment. Prior to joining Vanderbilt, he was a senior policy analyst at the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education. And for those of you that weren't here on the very beginning of the call, the woman who hired him, Joni Finney, is joining us today. Prior to that, Will received his master's degree in political science. And you'll see, I feel like, a lot of political science theory in his thinking, and a PhD in higher education administration at Stanford University. And since we share the same advisor, the illustrious Mike Kirst, I am proud to call Will my academic big brother. So I will stop my share and let Will take over.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. And yeah, as Sujin said, I got my start in California higher education policy. The original organization was the California Higher Education Policy Center, and I've continued to track policy issues in California since that time. And I've been really deeply impressed with the work that Sujin and her colleagues have been doing at California Competes. I think they've got the exactly the right policy priorities for what I understand about some of the key issues in the state. So, and then I just wanted to reiterate a couple of things that have already been mentioned. The first is, really, please do interrupt me with questions as we're going. I'd like this to be a conversation as much as possible. I have some ideas to share, but I'd really like to discuss them with you. And the second thing is just my co-author and friend, Jennifer Delaney, sends her sincere regrets. She was really looking forward to doing this, and this is very much a joint effort from both of us. Okay, so thinking about college costs. Usually when you're I worked in public opinion polling and did focus groups a long time ago. And usually when you talk about college costs, what people immediately jump to is thinking about tuition and fees, right? That what gets the public's attention on this issue is the fact that tuition has gone up so much. And so this shows some pretty familiar trends through the nation as a whole in terms of private four-year tuition. You've got public four-year in blue there, and then public two-year. Each of these, which have seen substantial increases over the last 30 years or so. And then if we put that on a percentage basis, that's going to look a little bit different because, of course, the publics were starting from a lower basis. But yeah, public four-year tuition has increased by 260% since 1991. It's really a dramatic and alarming increase. It's grabbed the public's attention. And so the quite natural question is, what's going on? Why are we seeing price increases like this? And so the first thing I want to emphasize is that price increases are a symptom. We might think they're the actual problem, but they're a symptom of a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is that the costs of higher education keep going up. The price of higher education, it's a tuition, it's what we ask students to pay. The cost is how much it costs a given institution to provide higher education for a student. And just so we can fix ideas a little bit, when I talk about the cost most of the time in this presentation, I'm going to be thinking about that in terms of what does it cost for a college to provide 1 year of education to a full-time undergraduate, all right? What is that kind of unit cost for an institution of higher education? So the first thing is for the nonprofit institutions, that cost is more than the price, right? It's, I think, one of the common misperceptions that people, outside of the field, kind of just like the general public, think of colleges kind of like firms. I think of them like companies, and firms charge prices that are above their costs so they can make a profit. Colleges don't do that. The costs are always higher than the price at nonprofit institutions. But even still, even with that, it's the cost of higher education that drives the price. As it becomes more expensive to provide a year of education, the institutions have to get that money from somewhere. And for public institutions, that it's a combination of state funds and tuition. And for private institutions, it's any private gifts that they can get plus tuition. But tuition's absolutely part of this. And the reason that we see these increasing prices in part is because of the increasing costs. Okay. Given that, do we have any kind of sense of like, is there like general agreement about like what it costs to provide a year of education? And the basic answer is no, right? It's actually remarkably different depending on the type of institution. So what we're looking at here is the revenues collected by institutions of higher education on a per student basis, looking at this kind of over time for different types of institutions. So if we look at the far left of that doctoral set of bars over there, and in 2018-19, it was about $20,000 a year, right? So, and that was split between the subsidies that they received, which were about $7,000, and the $12,000 in net tuition revenue. But at different types of institutions, that's a really different amount. And so if we're talking about institutions that provide mostly bachelor's degrees, that's about $13,000 a year. For associates granting institutions, that's about $11,000 per year. Each of those split between the subsidies that they receive and the net tuition revenue. And it's just a remarkable feature of this field that for what is nominally the same thing, like a year of undergraduate education, it costs a very different amount depending on what type of institution we're talking about. And particularly if we switch over to the right-hand side and we're looking at private institutions, you can see private institutions on average, it's for the doctoral institutions, $44,000 per year. And like bachelor's granting institutions, it's less than that, but still like $30,000 a year split between the subsidies that they're able to provide and the tuition that they charge. So there's on like a number of different dimensions, while we know that there's a cost and we know that the cost is more than the price, there's just like what it actually costs to do this, to provide students an education. Like a single answer does not present itself from the data. It's the same thing is true if you look across states. So this is data from the state higher education executive officers, and it's looking at just the split between state funding and tuition collected for public institutions of higher education over time. And so the way we kind of read this, if we look over in like the very earliest one in 1980, we've got about $9,000 or so coming from the education appropriations from the state. And then they collected on average about $2,300 from tuition revenues. And you can see those change over time. And there's two changes that are going on here. So the first is that the states have not kept up with the overall increase in costs, right? So by the time we get to 2020, for the nation as a whole, states are providing about $8,600 per student. So it's a little bit less than it was, back in the 80s, but it's not hugely different. But what has happened is the overall cost of higher education has increased during that time, and the difference has been made up for by tuition. So we get those very large public tuition increases that we were talking about in the right at the beginning there, as a result of this pattern. So we've got that at this point, the average tuition revenues collected from students is about $6,800. So this is just at a national level. We've seen this increase in the cost, and we've seen this change in the way that's paid for, with the states kind of doing a little bit less than they did in the 80s, considerably less than they did in the kind of late 90s, and that difference between what the states are able to do, the states are willing to do, and the overall cost of higher education being made up for by tuition. So I'll just mention really quickly, I'm not kind of glancing over at the chat, but if there's a question in the chat that comes in, or if you have one now or at any time, please get my attention. As a faculty member, I can go on indefinitely. So yeah, please let me know. Okay. All right, so there's that. That's the overall trend across like all of the states. But then that pattern is really different depending on which state we're talking about. So just as two kind of extreme examples of how states pay for higher education, on the one hand, we can look at a state like New Hampshire, which is at historically low appropriations for higher education. So you can see if we just look in the last year here, in 2020, New Hampshire provided about $4,700 per student, and then charged students, that they collected in terms of tuition revenues about $11,000 per student. So an overall cost of higher education of about $18,000, of which $11,000 comes from students. So that's one extreme. That is a state that has historically borne very, very little responsibility for paying for higher education and expecting students to cover the rest. If we go to the other extreme, we can look at a state like New Mexico. So in that same year, 2020, New Mexico provided about $13,000 per student in educational appropriations and collected only $3,700 per student. So the overall cost in New Mexico, a little bit less, more like $16,000 as opposed to $18,000 in a state like New Hampshire, but a dramatic difference in the tuition charged to students and the tuition collected from students in the state. So this, Sujin was talking about the simple Google search isn't going to get us there. And this is one of the reasons why, is that the cost of higher, the answer to how much does it cost to provide a year of higher education depends just so critically on all of these different factors. What type of institution are we talking about? What type of state are we talking about? Even when we're talking about what should nominally be kind of the same thing, a year of undergraduate education. So what we know is that we have seen these costs go up. We know that as a result of the costs going up and states being unwilling or unable to keep up with the increasing costs, we've seen tuition go up. But the core question still remains, why does it cost more year after year to provide provide an undergraduate education? Why does this keep on going up? So that's the main thing I wanted to talk about, is to go through the three different theories that we have as to what's going on here. And the reason for talking about theory, it's not just purely an academic conversation, although as an academic, I'm okay with those, but is because depending on which theory we think really helps explain what's going on, that dictates the policy solutions that we would favor. And of course, I don't think any one of these is entirely true, but it is important to kind of have some thinking behind, all right, what do we think is driving these costs, and therefore what can, if anything can be done, what can be done about it? All right, so I'll just pause there for a second and see if there's anything I can clarify or any questions that anybody has.
Well, I have a question. You said you're going into three theories. Does this mean that we don't know?
So for each of these, there's some evidence to support what the original authors of the theory suggested. However, there is not overwhelming evidence to suggest that any one of these can entirely account for the increase in college costs. So the answer to your question is we know a little. We know enough to make it to tell us. And then there's some others, I'll mention more briefly at the end. There's a couple of other theories that we're pretty sure don't apply, that are probably not the place to go looking for solutions. Okay, so we have 5 possible explanations, and I'm going to focus on the first 3 of these. So the first one here is what's known kind of ominously as cost disease, and kind of more positively as the string quartet theory. And so this was first proposed by William Bowen and William Baumol in a very famous article. And Baumol is a very famous economist. But something I learned about him recently is that he was also an artist, and so we can take a second to appreciate the artist economist. And Baumol was actually quite interested in the economics of the performing arts. And it actually leads into the theory that he has. They were looking at the economics of the performing arts, and particularly symphonies and other groups that perform classical music. And they keep on getting more expensive too. Every year it gets more expensive to run a symphony orchestra, to run an opera, to have a series, a series of performances of quartets. And it's an interesting question as to why. And so, it appears that it applies equally well to higher education. And so the basic idea is this. There's one side of the economy that every year gets more productive. And you think of productivity, it's like how much a worker can get done in a certain amount of time, like how much of something that a worker can produce. The most amazing increases in productivity that we've seen in our economy have been in agriculture. What 100 years ago, like what it took 100 people to do is accomplished by slightly less than one worker in agriculture now. When you drive up I-5 and you see the huge farms along the way there, it takes very, very few people to do that agricultural work compared to the amount that it used to. A huge part of our economy was devoted to agriculture. Lots of people worked in it. Barely anybody works in it now. It's much rarer to work in agriculture. And it's because they become so much more productive over time. And you can see this all over the place. It's in terms of what you get for your spending in terms of computing, the amazing computers we can get. And we all carry a supercomputer around in our pockets now. In all these different fields, they become more productive. They get more stuff out in an hour of work. So as that happens, the workers in those industries get paid more. It's not an even split between workers and owners, but the owners get more profit and the workers get paid some more. And so every year you can see the wages of those people in those productive industries going up. That's great. That is what it is to live in a kind of vibrant economy. However, it doesn't apply to the whole economy. So there are other sectors of the economy where productivity increases are not possible. And that's the reason it's called sometimes the string quintet theory, is that the number of people it takes to perform a string quintet is exactly the same now as it was when that string quintet was written in 1787. If you had fewer people do it, it wouldn't be a quintet anymore. And if they performed it faster, it wouldn't also, not a very enjoyable performance, right? I myself would not want to go to a performance of a very productive string quintet where they knock out as many as they can in an hour. So they can't improve. It's just, so they're kind of stuck there. And if you think of like the technology that I use in my classes, when I'm teaching in person, the technology that I use is exactly the same technology that would have been used 500 years ago. I stand in front of a classroom and I talk to the students. And so there's things I could do to become more productive, right? I could talk faster. I'm told I already talk kind of fast, but I could kind of get through as much material as possible in an hour. I could teach as many students as possible. I could pack my students. I had Adam in class, and I do think that there's something to having a limited number of students in class in terms of the environment. If he'd been in class with 200 or 300 other students, I don't know if I would have been able to get to know him as well. And so, yeah, it appears as though there's areas of the economy where workers cannot become more productive over time. The thing is, though, people on that non-productive part of the economy want to get the same wage increases as the people in the productive side of the economy. So even though they're not getting more work done, even though the classical music performers aren't, getting more stuff done, or professors may not be getting more stuff done, they expect pay increases that are like somewhat on par with what we'd see. Otherwise, there's going to be a gradual shift of workers in the non-productive side over to the productive side. Now, they do acknowledge that people just like doing this. They like, I love being a professor. People love performing music. Maybe there's going to be this differential. They call it psychic wages, which I love. This is like a great term. So like people get paid in, psychic wages. They get, because they're going to get paid a little bit less than they get paid if they worked in the, the productive side of the economy. But it's the pay increases that are an issue, and it's a pretty regular feature that the workers in these non-productive sectors are going to just kind of want pay increases that are at least kind of on par with what we see in the productive side of the economy. So the implications of this are pretty, a little bit bleak for higher education in terms of like the title of this talk, Can Anything Be Done About College Costs? Cost disease more or less says for the core technology, for the actual like teaching and learning part of higher education, the answer is no. We just have to expect that there's going to be sectors in the economy that have these increases over time. So to Sujin's question, do we know, and like which of these have evidence or not? The thing is, I do think that cost disease does play a role, and Archibald and Feldman wrote a pretty comprehensive book on the topic. Why does college cost so much? And their answer was more or less cost disease. But if you look at these increases, this is college tuition and fees. So it's not cost, it's price, but we compare it to medical care, things like shelter, and then other areas of the economy. The increases in higher education have been disproportionate relative to even something like medical care. It is considered, many people consider that medical care is an area where, yeah, you're going to see cost disease as well. And tuition and fees go, much higher than that. Okay. So then the next theory is Bowens' revenue theory of cost. There was Baumol and Bowen. This is a different Bowen, Howard Bowen. It's very simple. This is like one of the simplest theories I ever get to teach. Universities raise all the money they can and they spend all the money they raise. That's it. There's a little bit more to it. Bowen is basically saying this, that like colleges and universities, there's no end to the set of activities that they could undertake. And they're pursuing prestige. They don't have a profit motive. They don't have anything that's like, should they do it or not? Like, should a college run a museum? Sure. Should a college run a nuclear accelerator? Sure. Right? There's a bunch of things that colleges could do, and they're all kind of interesting and compelling reasons to do it. So what they're going to do is they're going to raise all the money they can. And we don't have a good definition of how much. This is what I started with. We don't have a great definition of like, how much does it cost to provide a year of college? We don't really know. So they're going to just raise all the money they can. Once they get all the money they can, they're going to spend all that they raise. And so that just keeps going. In terms of the evidence here, I will point you to, I'm sure that like me, all of you were relieved that Harvard was able to meet its campaign goals a few years ago in 2018. I was staying up at night wondering whether or not they'd be able to collect $9 billion. And I know we all rested more easily when they collected $9.62 billion in their most recent campaign. So if you think about like, can a college or a university ever say that they have enough money? And I think we have an object lesson here, right? Did Harvard have enough money when it had, about $43 billion? No, obviously, because they needed more than that. They now have $53.2 billion for the 22,000 students who were enrolled there. Just to put that in context, the country of France has $36 billion. So like Harvard has more money than France. And so to think about like, will colleges left to their own devices raise all the money they can and spend all they raise? I think there's some evidence that that's true. It might not apply to every college everywhere, but there's certainly, if there's any institution that could say that's probably enough, that institution has not yet said that's probably enough. Okay. And then the last one is this idea of the arms race. And this comes from Gordon Winston. And the idea here comes back to our inability to define what constitutes like a good quality cost of a year of education. So like, what's a good college, what's not so good, what college is high value or not. And unfortunately, the way that we resolve a lot of these questions within higher education is via positional ranking. And particularly, it's just like the influence of rankings like US News and World Report. Whereas opposed to saying, oh, well, like these institutions do a good job, these institutions, might have some issues, there's a ranking. And when you get into a ranking kind of situation, each institution is competing with the other institution on a variety of elements to move ahead of the next institution. So instead of saying, okay, this is what would be a good undergraduate education, and we're going to try and accomplish that at the lowest possible cost, the institutions are looking at each other and saying, well, if that institution has this, then we should have that. And they're continuously doing this. And so once institutions are kind of in any situation, the game theoretics behind this is once you're engaged in an arms race, it's very, very difficult to unilaterally stop because the other competitors are just going to continue with that arms race. By way of entirely anecdotal evidence, I present you with the following. First of all, this is the climbing wall at Colorado State University out in Fort Collins. I used to rock climb out in California. That looks like a really nice climbing wall. That would have been awesome to have at an institution. At UC Boulder, they have a rather lovely swimming pool for the students. And then just to complete the cycle for us, CSU in Fort Collins also has a climbing wall with a swimming pool. So every possible amenity provided for the students at these institutions. So that's not, again, this is entirely anecdotal, and we can talk a little bit more about the broader evidence that we see for these different theories. But because there's not a single definition for this is what is constitutes a good quality kind of undergraduate education, makes it very difficult to then say, for an institution to say, oh, well, we know that it costs less to go here. We know we don't have all of the amenities of another institution, but we can assure you that an individual who comes here will receive an excellent education. And instead, the institutions compete in a variety of different ways, some of which might help educational quality, but others of which appear to have at least very loose connections with educational quality in order to kind of compete in this institutional arms race, as Gordon Winston had it. Okay. So this can happen in knowledge production in terms of I was kind of picking on student amenities, but there's faculty amenities as well in terms of just providing more time for professors to be away from the classroom and engaging in their own research, which enhances their disciplinary prestige. The competition among institutions to hire top faculty can contribute to increasing salaries. There's increased technology needs in fields, some of which are extraordinarily expensive. There's just a lot of the knowledge production, and particularly a positional arms race in knowledge production, can lead to the same kind of situation. Okay. So then the question is, and this is what I hope we can spend the remainder of the hour actually just discussing, is what can we do if we look at this? Should we just expect that the year-to-year increase in college costs is just absolutely what we should expect over time, and it's just the responsibility of policymakers to figure out a way to pay for it? Or are there things that can be done from the perspective of policy to actually either encourage or guide institutions towards becoming more cost-effective with the resources that they have? So the idea here is, I kind of start back where I mentioned before. I don't think any one of these explains all of what we've seen. But each of these, I do think, each of the different theories plays a role, and it's different for different types of institutions. So I think cost disease does apply widely across the field of higher education. If cost disease is the driving factor behind college costs, then what needs to be done is to seek out as much efficiency from the areas that are not part of the core technology of teaching and learning as possible. So this would be as the administrative functions undertaken by every university in terms of human resources management, in terms of back office management. There's been enormous increases in the efficiency of those different areas in other industries that have not been shared by higher education. There's probably a lot that could be learned. We kind of people within higher education, they'll say corporate, it's a bad thing, but corporations can be really efficient. I think there's a lot to be learned. The idea being that because the core technology is going to get more expensive over time, there will be cost increases, but that doesn't have to apply to institutions as a whole. And in fact, from the perspective of the state, even thinking about things in terms of campuses, as opposed to, okay, how do we just have the most effective delivery of education to students, is a place to start. There's a lot of arbitrary campus divisions that even just thinking, I know that California Competes works a lot on regional collaboration, getting institutions within the same region to collaborate in different ways, and particularly on back office items can be really helpful. If you think the revenue theory of costs is what's primarily driving these increases, then the solution is as simple as the theory. It's limit the amount of money going into institutions. And I think it's, that the way of thinking about this would be more along the lines of, it's about increases. And I think that, thinking about a reasonable and predictable level of increase in both tuition and state appropriations. Many times in states, we see this pattern of steep cuts during downturns, increases during good times, and tuition making up the difference. So you have, fortunately, in the most recent recession, we didn't see this, primarily because the federal government stepped in. But most of the time we've seen tuition increases during recessions. That didn't happen. But still, having both limited and predictable tuition increases and appropriations would be the appropriate response if we think the revenue theory of costs apply. And then in terms of the arms race, I do think the arms race applies to a broader set of institutions than we might sometimes think, that institutions engage in positional competition, across a number of different areas. And it's not just, the most selective institutions that do this kind of stuff. And I think that the entrepreneurial energy and activity that's associated with this should be encouraged, but towards societal goals, and thinking about, instead of competition with other institutions in terms of offering amenities for students or faculty or so on, the competition among institutions for providing the most quality and for the most value could be something that we could think about a lot more. Like it says on the presentation, I don't think that these are mutually exclusive. I think that there's the combined set of policies that are suggested here could actually work together. But I think that, coming back to the beginning, just as an overall perspective, remembering that the cost increases are not inevitable, and that what's coming back to the point of contact for most people with this issue is around price, but price is driven by cost. And until we start thinking really seriously about costs, we're not going to be able to deal with these prices. So I'll stop there and see if there's questions or comments or objections. I'd be happy to talk about any.
Thanks, Will. I will take the host's privilege and ask the first question, but please jump in, folks. Feel free to unmute, raise your hand, chat, however you feel most comfortable chiming in. I would love to, I think the thing that came to me as you're talking is, has anyone addressed this well? What are there promising practices that institutions or states, the federal government, even internationally, that have executed, that have helped address the high cost of college?
So a couple of things that I think are fairly promising. One of the most interesting things that was done in terms of thinking about the cost disease was a series of initiatives by Britt Kerwin at the University of Maryland, kind of from about 2005 to 2015. And what they did was, within campuses and across campuses, identified as many inefficiencies in the way that they were conducting the business of the organizations, and particularly that they tried to combine operations across campuses. Because from the perspective of the state, again, like the campus divisions are kind of arbitrary, and we want the system as a whole to be working towards providing a quality education for hopefully a lower cost. So that was really remarkable, and it worked really well. Maryland had low tuition increases during that time. It bought, I think the state leadership was really responsive to what the University of Maryland was doing, and at the same time they saw steady increases in state appropriations, even when there were cuts in other states, because of this recognition that the institute, the system was doing everything it could to find efficiencies. So in terms of the revenue theory of cost, what you do see is that in states where the state has tried to put together a framework in terms of here's how much tuition increases are going to be over time, where they've, at least on that side, tried to make it so that tuition increases are steady and predictable over time. First of all, it just makes a difference in terms of prices. That does keep the prices down. The outcomes from those states look very much like outcomes in states where that wasn't in place. And so if the concern is, well, if we don't have these tuition increases, it's going to really adversely affect quality. It's really difficult to know what quality is and to have a single definition of it. But just if we think, if we can look at the broad outcomes in terms of degree completion and students persisting over time, look about the same. There's not huge differences there. And so as my own state, Tennessee, has undertaken an initiative of that kind, and other states have as well, and that does seem at least not to have severe negative outcomes. The thing about like the revenue theory of costs is you can definitely cut too much. Like that you can reduce the levels of funding for institutions to the point where they are not going to be able to function effectively anymore. And some states have done that. And so on the flip side of that, I absolutely would not advocate that. I don't think that there's, I do think that there's, levels that need to be maintained, but there's wide variation in performance at like any given level of funding for higher education above, say, like the average. So that's another possibility. And then the arms race, the solution there is really about conversations, like ongoing conversations with institutions about mission priorities, and like not exclusively just mission statements, but reconciling the activities of the institution with the priorities that have been jointly set with the state. And that really does seem to, push the competition in really useful directions from the perspective of state policy. One of the solutions was thought to be on this last one, on terms of the arms race, was something like outcomes-based funding. The theory being, if you pay for outcomes, the institutions will reform their practices such that they'll move towards the outcomes that the state has provided for the institutions. Really didn't see that. The outcomes-based funding hasn't been, hasn't had many of the negative outcomes that we thought might happen, but it also hasn't been many of the positive outcomes. It doesn't seem to have moved the needle on these issues as much as many had hoped. But I do think it comes back down to the ensuring that the activities of the institutions are in line with the mission priorities.
I see we have a hand from Julia. Julia, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. This is great, Will. I really appreciate this. I have a question. I'm not sure. I think it's related to the revenue theory, but just particularly in California, whatever the level of funding is that we're spending to, what happens in California is that our economy is so volatile that even in not terrible years, our general fund can really, really fluctuate quite a bit. And so those are the years, and then of course it's much worse in recession times. Those are the years when, boom, you know, you hit with tuitions. Now we haven't had those because the governor essentially forced the institutions to freeze tuition, Governor Brown. But the reality is that that's been the practice. The minute the revenue state general fund goes down, you got to make up that hole, and that comes with tuition. Well, here's my question to you. Do you know of any state or anybody that has a fund that is countercyclical? In other words, that when revenues go down, sort of like the unemployment insurance fund, rather than hitting the families at the worst time when they're suffering the hardships of a recession or a downturn, that there is a way to level that off, and then when good times come back up, replenish that fund. Is anybody done that anywhere that you're aware of?
As far as I know, the answer is no. And that is it's a huge problem. And so there's a longtime budget analyst that called higher education the balance wheel of state finance, because, you know, the state revenues go down, and state revenues are quite volatile. You know, states with, you know, depending on the tax base, whatever kind of tax base the state has, it's more narrow that typically when the feds have, and the states can't borrow. And so, yeah, you get really steep decreases in state funding during downturns in the economy. The state policymakers have to make incredibly difficult choices. And one of the things that they're going to many times are going to do is they're going to have cuts for higher education. First of all, because, you know, the other areas they're considering cutting are things like Medicaid or K-12 education. You know, things are incredibly important. And so there will be cuts to higher education, and higher education will have the difference with tuition increases. Exactly what you were saying. That's a really well-known pattern. My colleague Jennifer Delaney has worked on this a lot. And unfortunately, I hate to have bad news on this, but there have been times when institutions have tried to make some effort to create reserves or, you know, essentially their own rainy day funds. The problem is many times during downturns, the states come back and rescind those as well. And so instead of the institutions being able to use those reserves that they held on to for this purpose, they lose those. You know, from the state's perspective, they have extra money, and the institutions are in a position of losing that. So where I think we need to go on this is increased state-federal cooperation. We've seen in each of the last two recessions, the federal government has unevenly stepped in to backfill some of the cuts in state funding. It was done at the last minute. It wasn't done in a way that was necessarily the right way to do it, but they did do it. And I think that needs to be systematized. We need to have a clear understanding of what the state and federal responsibilities are, and the circumstances under which the federal government is likely to, you know, create an ongoing system where the federal government is going to say, okay, during these downturns, we'll moderate or even, you know, stop these tuition increases. That's a whole other very difficult problem. The Americans College Promise program, the free community college tuition program that was proposed by the Biden administration, had some solutions to that, but at the state level, I haven't seen any successful solutions to that problem. I'm sorry to say.
Thank you. No matter how bad the news is, but thank you.
I mean, the upside is, you know, federal intervention was more or less kind of out of the question for a very long time. It just and so that has happened in two recessions in a row is progress. It's actually a rather remarkable change in the relationship between the states and the federal government with regard to higher ed funding. But it's not systematic. It's everything's been done on an emergency basis.
Can I ask a second question, unless there's somebody else on the queue? When you talk about productivity, you're right that I understand Baumol's theory and so forth, but
sure.
several times, you talk about lack of demand for majors or departments, or there are cuts, and in a sense your productivity goes up because you're doing less of something. Are there states that have successfully contained their costs doing that while not fully compromising their ability to offer a quality undergraduate education?
Yes, it does, as you kind of talked about, it does involve sometimes really difficult conversations about both what institutions are going to do and how they're going to do it. But that is absolutely a possibility. And I think the other point of pushback on what I was talking about is that, we just all underwent a kind of an involuntary 2-year experiment on alternative means of providing education. And I think that this is something I know that California Competes is working on a lot. There's a ton of promise in terms of using, technologically mediated instruction to be able to do so in a much more cost-effective way. And it's less a question of like, does it work or not? Is it good or bad? It's like there are more effective and less effective ways to undertake that. And so figuring that out and then bringing it to scale, I think, is a big and important project, which would be better if higher education as a field in concert with state policymakers. It'd be better to have that from the inside as opposed to something that, that we got from like a more kind of coming from outside the field itself. That's my perspective.
Great. We have 2 questions waiting patiently. Roger, do you want to, I saw your hand up first, and then Adam after that.
Sure. A couple of things. First of all, under the Bowman's 5 rules, what did you articulate to be on the first point? It was what drives the institutions and they spend all their money on it. What were those points?
So we'll go back so I remember exactly, but it's essentially prestige. Excellence, prestige, and influence is the way that Bowen
that's
thought about it.
Yeah. First of all, it would seem that the productive economy provides the resources to pay for the non-productive economy, regardless of whether it's education or art or whatever.
Yeah.
But the perverse influence in education, probably more so than others, are a whole bunch of different revenue sources separate from the direct contribution of the productive economy. One of those revenue sources that you didn't talk about that I think can be significant are subsidized loans and tuition assistance. And I think it would seem to me that's pretty important to keep in mind. Those are all revenues. You stated really as what are really revenues to the system. You identified them as costs. And in a typical economic analysis, of course, the word cost refers to the expense structure of the institution itself. I don't know whether that confuses it or not, but I just, I guess I'm an economic purist in that point.
I appreciate that, yeah.
But you also talked about outcome-based funding, right? And you said it doesn't work. How are outcomes, and I have another point after this, how are outcomes stated when that has been tried and not succeeded?
Yeah. So the 2 points, both of which I think are incredibly important. The first is, so we're kind of looking at these trends in tuition over time. We saw the tuition go up, the kind of state funding wasn't able to keep up with the increases, tuition went up. What we drifted into as a society, the solution we kind of drifted into as a society to that problem was borrowing the money. The students and families, because they were not able to pay from their own income or savings, were forced to borrow the money. And we ended up with $1.6 trillion in student loan debt, bigger than any other source of consumer, non-mortgage debt. I don't think anybody intended to get there, but that's where we ended up with by drifting into this solution. That's obviously not tenable. So, there is I think there's a perfectly valid perspective that says, as the society gets more wealthy as a result of increased productivity, it can begin paying more for these non-productive science. I think that is like absolutely a legitimate perspective. The theory that's associated with this, which I just didn't get into for the sake of time, is William Bennett's. It's called the Bennett hypothesis. And so when Bennett was Reagan's Secretary of Education, he said he didn't want to spend any more money on student financial aid because the colleges just raised tuition to capture all of that additional financial aid. That's actually, there's been some pretty rigorous analysis on that, and has been found not to be the case. That actually institutions of higher education, if what they wanted to do was just raise tuition to like get all of the financial aid that they could, they're not doing that. The institutions that are the for-profit institutions in many places have been shown to actually do that, but non-profit institutions don't seem to be doing that. But there's no way that we could have like paid for those tuition increases without the debt, right? That was the solution, but it can't be the solution going forward. There just seems to be like broad consensus that cannot be the solution moving forward.
So,
so the second question was on outcomes-based funding.
Yes, what are the outcome measurements that have been used where it's proven?
So what they do is they typically structure it in terms of like numbers of degrees produced. So they'll say like, oh, we're going to produce, the institution is going to be responsible for producing this many bachelor's degrees, this many credits from students, and numeric targets for specific outcomes. It's supposed to direct institutional attention towards certain goals. And yeah, it hasn't. It just hasn't had the effects as large as the proponents hoped, nor is it as negative as some of the detractors said it would be.
Well, it seems to me that's the plague that we kind of have in the public sector, and I'll try to make this quick, but there's a tendency in the public sector to measure outcomes based upon activity, not based upon results. And I'm going to get very theoretical here, and maybe you can never get to it. But that's kind of a perverse way, I think, of measuring what an institution of higher education should produce. What an institution of higher education is really a perpetuation of the success of the society, mostly in economic terms. That is to say, it's an economic driver. And it seems to me the success of an institution of higher education, largely, not in each individual case, but largely is going to be a function of how much revenue is driven by the productivity of those that go into the productive economy. The reason that that's hard to say today is because it's a future event. But if we can translate that to current activity that is as a result of graduates of institutions of higher education, then those institutions can use that as a selling point to recruit students and therefore say, what you're going to pay us as value because you're going to make a lot of money when you go out and get a job. And my sense is that colleges and universities don't want to be measured that way, but it would seem to me that if they were, it would justify the value, and then they wouldn't have to compete by building a climbing wall and then building a swimming pool and then building a climbing wall with a swimming pool. They say, you come here and we're going to educate you and you're going to get a great job and have a comfortable living.
Yeah, I think that your point is well taken, that even when we try and talk about outcomes, and like the outcomes that are pointed to, those really aren't outcomes. Outcomes are, how much did the person learn? How much did they develop? How much are they able, if we're measuring it in terms of participation in the workforce, how much do their earnings increase as a result of attending? Those are a lot of the outcomes that we think of are really, I agree with you, more like activities. We want to make sure the activities are in line with what the state's needs are. But again, I think it comes back to this definition of quality, which is really, really difficult to get to. Thank you for the questions and comments.
I hate to jump in, but I must. We're at 2:01, and I know we're supposed to wrap up at 2 p.m. So I wanted to, first of all, say thank you and thank the folks that have joined us today for this great conversation. And I also wanted to note that Will is able to stay on a little longer if there are any additional questions that folks want to and are able to stick around and ask, or if there's any questions you'd like to have asked please, but have to run, just throw them in the chat, and I will ask Will, and you could watch it on the recording when it comes out. But I just wanted to acknowledge the time and be respectful.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
I know Adam had a question, but he was running out.
I had a question. It took me forever to type it.
Hey, Adam.
Hey, Will. Thank you for being here. Talking about costs, this was a much cheaper lecture than the last one I got.
Lots of value for the money on this one.
No, I mean, this is great. I mean, I work with a lot of the universities here, and so this is great context for me. I do have to run to a meeting actually with a college president. I chatted it to Sujin, but it's asking about the kind of duty of a university to place restricted funds in scholarships with the rise of tuition, and what kind of work maybe needs to be done to get that going.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. It's so nice to see you. I know you got to go.
It's really nice to see you. Thank you for this. Thank you, Sujin. I'm very excited to see the recording for the answer to that question.
All right.
All right. Bye.
So should I kind of jump in on that one? Does that make sense?
Yes, please.
Okay. So you will hear from college presidents all the time that one of the reasons that costs go up is because of the increasing cost of financial aid. But that's a little bit circular, because the need for financial aid comes from tuition, and the tuition's going up because the costs are going up. And so it's a little, there's, I think, a bigger question around what is a reasonable price to charge to individuals based on their income. And one of the key difficulties that we keep on having in terms of financial aid is, I think you can see like remarkable progress in places like California, other states, in terms of really providing strong financial aid packages from the state for students. But then the ability of that financial aid to keep up with tuition increases, it kind of isn't there. So the tuition goes up and the state's financial aid package kind of can't keep up with that. You see it with the Pell Grant too, that the purchasing the Pell Grant keeps on going down. So I don't think the states or the federal government are going to be able to make real progress on affordability of higher education until we start having much more serious conversations about the costs of higher education. And so that it's not easy, and there aren't simple solutions here. As I think it's pretty clear. But financial aid on its own is not going to be able to solve the problem of college affordability, because we're just going to continue to get tuition increases over time. From the institution's perspective, the other thing that's happening in institutions is the same kind of arms race, but it's for students. And so institutions spend, and I know Alejandra has done a lot of work on this in terms of enrollment management, but institutions spend a lot of money on students who can absolutely afford to go to college. And the reason they do that is because they want to, have students with better academic credentials coming into their schools, because one of the ways we measure quality of schools is by the types of students who go there. So for public institutions, there's quite a bit that can be done to push on those institutions to provide, aid when they do so on the basis of need. But there's actually, like, private institutions, there's a lot more that could be done to encourage private institutions too, in terms of how the private institutions are really, really dependent on federal student aid, both grants and loans. And those could come with some conditions, particularly around, what are the prices that students at your institution have to pay? That's not, that is not a popular topic, as one might imagine. But I do think that there's a lot that both the states and the federal government could do to encourage institutions to use their funds, their scholarship funds, in a way that could increase college affordability. And Joni.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to mention
Speaking of college affordability, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I have two parts of this. Well, going back to Julia's comment or question about has any state been able to establish some type of rainy day fund that would protect higher education a little bit. That was actually part of the piece that Irwin did from the time frame that you cited.
That's right.
And it was really a compact between the legislature. There's a lot more trust in Maryland than most states, but the legislature, the system heads, and the business community. And it started in 2007 that the business community would basically tax themselves, and this fund would grow over time so that when we went through this cyclical downturn, there would be some money available. Now, of course, 2008, the recession came, and then, Britt left eventually, and he was followed by another chancellor who didn't support this and some financial aid policies and things like that. So I think what they had there, the compact, the political support needed to hold all this together kind of disintegrated. Yeah. And that's what's, I think, missing in so many states to keep us from progressing on so many of these things. And then, Will, one question I had for you, and Sujin, you can tell me if I got this right. I read that the University of California, since most of you are from California, wants to pass, or the regents did pass kind of guaranteed tuition. And so there would be tuition established for every incoming cohort. So we've had this experiment in Illinois. So Will, could you tell me what this does for both revenue and costs?
So if you think about, so this is the idea of we're going to have steady and predictable tuition increases, and also when the students come in, they're going to pay the same tuition every year that they're in college. Yeah. So the states that have put that in place, I mean, first of all, it accomplishes the goal, right? That you can see that it does tend to work. It's relatively politically popular, and you don't tend to see the big spikes in tuition. Unlike some of the other ones there are some higher ed policies that can get kind of cast to the wayside during difficult times. There's others that seem to be pretty durable. This one appears to be pretty durable. The second part is, like so much else, when we're the link between the funds coming in and then what happens in terms of the outcomes, there's not a big observable difference in those states in terms of the outcomes for students, right? The concern would be, if we don't have those tuition revenues, that's going to decrease quality, and it's going to mean that graduation rates go down and people can't get the classes they need and all these other things. We don't tend to see it. The institutions appear able to navigate the situation where they're not able to increase tuition in the way that they had in the past, and instead can find ways to operate effectively at those levels of prices. Does that answer your question, Joni?
Yeah, I didn't know if what they were doing was increasing enough to sort of hedge their bets against this downturn.
Yeah, it does depend on the amount.
Paying more costs, or
Yeah. This, obviously not new to you, because it was an idea that you came up with. But I think, this idea of increasing tuition no faster than family ability to pay, particularly something like median family income, is just crucial. And that it can't just be, the predictable tuition increases are one thing, but like affordable tuition increases are the other. And what we know is that there's lots of different ways to get this done, and the states that are bringing in somewhat lower tuition revenues appear able to create college graduates.
Yeah, so that's important. So Will, just one other point I want to make from the economic perspectives that you presented, they all offer something, and they all have some real limitations in explaining increased prices and costs of higher education. So that leads me to believe that we've neglected the political aspects and the political explanation for all of this. And how do we, engage that constructively to make sure we can put that in place and hold it together over time and make the necessary changes as students and state needs change?
Yeah, there is a technocratic aspect to kind of some of both the theories and the solutions that I discussed, and I think that's an excellent critique. What's positive about the discussion about loan debt is that it's like we are addressing, even if indirectly at a societal level, like what are our expectations in terms of how much we should the society should be paying for higher education, how much we should expect students and families to pay for, and how much we're going to push on to future generations, because that's really what loans are, is borrowing from ourselves in the future. But I'm frustrated with the conversation because we're not engaging one of the core constituencies, which is the institutions, and what's the institution responsibility for moderating their costs over time and finding ways to effectively use these funds. So, but I don't see that we're going to make progress on these questions unless we address it in that way, in terms of the responsibilities of these stakeholders, and have relatively clear messages about what's expected of each. This is what government should do. And that's going to be different from state to state, but like most states don't have a conversation where this gets articulated. Instead, it's very, it's year to year, it's the tuition's going to be this, financial aid's going to be that, but it has to be bigger. And so, a clear statement of the responsibilities of each of these stakeholders, and I think the federal government has an important role to play in that. I think part of the frustration that a lot of people have about the debate about should we forgive student debt really isn't about like forgiveness of student debt. It's about we're having that in the absence of a much bigger conversation about how are we going to meet this obligation to make sure that we can create an educated society.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Great. Well, tell us, I guess, do you have time for another question? Should we wrap up, or?
I think I'm just about there. I've got a dissertating student that I've got to get to. I really enjoyed this. Thank you again so much.